Okay, so picture this scenario. You've got your CNC program. It looks fine, just a text file. You're trying to load it using one of those USB floppy emulators, maybe like a FlexiDrive.
Yeah, those handy little things.
Right. And you do the transfer, seems okay, but then you check the file in the CNC memory and boom, question marks, loads of them. Your code's mangled. What is going on?
It's super frustrating, isn't it? It seems like it should just work, a simple copy. But yeah, something's breaking down in translation, basically.
Exactly. And, well, that specific problem, that's what this deep dive is focused on today. We're going to unpack why text files get corrupted, turning into question marks. When you use these USB floppy emulators, specifically thinking about things like the FlexiDriveMV-USB talking to CNC memory. Our mission, really, looking at the source materials you shared, is to figure out the potential causes. It seems simple, but it's clearly, well, annoying.
It really is, and let's get into it. The sources, they lay out quite a few possibilities. It's rarely just one single thing, which, makes it harder to diagnose.
Right, a whole list. So one of the first big areas the sources mention is file system or formatting issues.
Yeah, this is fundamental. Like, how is that USB stick formatted? Or maybe even the virtual floppy image file itself, the .ima or .img file.
How it was created.
Exactly. Some older CNCs or the emulators talking to them, they might be expecting something really specific, maybe like FAT16, something quite old school.
Got it.
And if you give it something else, NTFS or XFT or whatever, the whole file structure might just confuse it. It can't read it properly.
So that's one angle. Then the sources really zero in on character encoding mismatches. This sounds technical, but it's key.
It's like languages, really. Your text file is written in one digital language, maybe UTF-8, super common now.
Right.
But the CNC, it might only speak a much older dialect, like plain standard ASCII, or maybe even a weird specific character set from the original manufacturer, an OEM set.
So if the file uses characters the CNC doesn't have in its vocabulary,
it just throws its hands up. It can't display what it doesn't understand. And that's actually why you see the question mark, according to the sources.
Ah, okay. So the question mark is literally the CNC saying, I got something here, but I have no clue what it is.
Precisely. It's the default placeholder for an unrecognized character code based on the encoding it expects.
Makes sense. But it's not always the file's language, right? The sources also talk about data transfer errors.
Yeah, physical issues during the actual copying process. Could be electrical noise interfering with the signal between the emulator and the CNC.
Like static.
Sort of, yeah. Or maybe the power supply isn't stable, or there's even a tiny fault inside the emulator's electronics. Just enough to flip a few bits here and there during transmission.
Wow, so the data literally gets corrupted mid-flight, almost.
It could, yeah. And related to that, the sources also flag image file corruption. That virtual floppy file, the .ima or .img you put on the USB stick. Maybe that file was damaged from the start. Or it got corrupted when you copied it onto the USB drive. Or, heck, maybe the USB drive itself is just old and failing.
So is the problem the transfer? Or was the source data already bad? Good question.
And sources keep going.
Yeah.
They mention emulator firmware bugs. The software inside the emulator, it's not perfect.
Right, like any software.
It might just have a glitch, a bug that only shows up under certain conditions, maybe with specific file types or characters.
Okay. And it's not always the new tech, is it? The sources say the CNC controller itself could be the issue.
Definitely. Especially older controllers. They might just have limits on which characters they understand, or internal processing errors. Maybe even buffer overflows if the file's too big or complex for its little brain.
Right, the CNC's own limitations.
And think about where the file came from before the USB stick, the software used to create or edit the CNC program.
Ah, like the CAM software or text editor?
Exactly. If that software didn't save it as pure, plain ASCII or whatever format the CNC needs, it might have sneakily inserted hidden characters, formatting codes, stuff like that.
Invisible junk that messes things up. Yeah, I've seen that.
And finally, the sources point to something that seems tiny but is apparently critical. End of file or end of line marker issues.
How the lines end.
Yeah, like should it be a carriage return and a line feed, CRLF like Windows, or just a line feed, LF like Unix Linux. CNCs can be incredibly picky about this.
No, seriously.
Oh yeah, and also how the file signals, I'm done. If those markers are wrong, the CNC's parser can just get lost, misinterpret data, maybe even stop reading too early.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot of potential causes. But the sources highlighted something else, right? Something really important.
Yes, absolutely. This was flagged as highly important in the material. The emulator, the FlexiDrive, for instance, often needs specific configuration files, usually a file ending in CFG. And these config files are often tailored exactly to the CNC brand and sometimes even the model. Using the wrong CFG file, say one for a FNOC controller when you're plugged into a Mazak, is called out as a very common direct path to these kinds of transfer problems and character errors.
Ah, so you have to use the right profile for your specific machine.
That's what the sources strongly suggest. It's not just another item on the list, it's potentially the item to check first or second.
That is a huge takeaway.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting that config file right is critical. What else do the sources suggest for troubleshooting?
Well, the basics first, like double check, triple check the file is saved as plain ASCII, no funny formatting.
Simple stuff.
Try a completely different USB drive, just in case the drive itself is the problem. Recreate that .ima or .img file from scratch using the correct tools and formatting.
Good idea.
Check if there's a firmware update available for the USB emulator itself. Maybe they fixed a bug you're hitting.
Right.
Use a really simple test file, like just a few lines of basic G code. See if that transfer is okay. Helps isolate the problem.
Yeah, narrow it down.
And finally, maybe even digging into the CNC's own parameters, if you can. See if there are settings related to communication ports, I/O, or character sets you can adjust.
So it's a whole process, really, looking at the file, the USB, the emulator, the config, the CNC.
Pretty much. A systematic approach based on what the sources outline.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what's the big picture here? This deep dive, looking at these sources, it shows this question mark issue isn't usually just one thing.
No, it's often a mix, or it could be any one of these things we discussed.
Right, whole cascade. From really basic stuff like file encoding and structure to hardware glitches during the actual transfer, software bugs in either the emulator or the CNC, and even these tiny details like how a line ends. But understanding this list, the one laid out in the sources, it gives you, the listener, a structured way to actually tackle the problem. You can start checking things off.
And connecting those dots, that absolute critical point the sources kept emphasizing was checking that CNC-specific configuration file for the emulator, that CFG file.
That's the prime suspect, flagged as highly important.
Definitely the place to look very carefully. But also, don't forget the basics the sources mentioned. Simplify. Check the file encoding first. Is it plain ASCII? That's often a key first step.
Absolutely. This whole deep dive, it really hammers home how vital these seemingly small technical standards are. Things like character encoding or end-of-line markers, especially for, well, older systems talking to newer adapters.
Yeah, tiny details with big consequences.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Thinking beyond CNCs in our super interconnected world today. Where else might these subtle little mismatches in digital languages or communication standards be causing hidden problems, glitches, or limitations in more complex systems that maybe we just kind of take for granted?
That's a really interesting thought. Where else are these invisible translation errors happening? Something definitely worth pondering.